Okay, so the Senate map just got turned upside down again, and I mean that literally, because we've had a nominee change, 4 brand new polls, and at least one result that's going to make you do a double take by the end of this video. Troy Jackson is officially on the ballot in Maine, and the very first poll testing him against Susan Collins already has him ahead. Sherrod Brown has quietly slipped into the lead in the Ohio polling average. Iowa is now dead even, tied to the decimal point. And down in Texas, I still can't quite believe I'm saying this. One of the newest surveys has James Talarico out in front of Ken Paxton. Zoom out and look at all of that together, and the fight for the Senate looks like a completely different battlefield than it did just a few months ago. But here's the part that actually matters most. This isn't just about Democrats picking up a few more opportunities. It's that they now may have more realistic paths to the majority than they actually need to win it. Quick refresher before we dive in. Republicans currently hold the Senate 53 to 47, which means Democrats need a net gain of 4 seats to flip control. I'm going to walk you through this entire map state by state, starting with the locks and working our way into the knife's edge races that will actually decide who runs the chamber in January. Stick around because the very last state on this list produces the single biggest surprise of the whole cycle. Let's knock out the safe states first. On the Democratic side, nothing's moving in Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, or Illinois. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware aren't going anywhere either, and Virginia rounds out the list. Could Republicans shave a few points off their losing margins in some of these? Sure, but there's a massive gap between slightly closer and actually winnable. And none of these states are anywhere near that second category. On the Republican side, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Kansas are locked in. So are Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, along with Alabama and Tennessee, plus Kentucky and West Virginia. I'm also keeping South Carolina in the safe Republican column, even with all the chaos around who the actual nominee ends up being. That uncertainty might make headlines, but it doesn't come close to putting the seat in play. South Carolina is still one of the reddest states in the country, open primary or not. By the way. Please leave your questions or comments in the comment section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now let's continue. Now let's move into the likely tier, where things start getting interesting. Minnesota is my first likely Democratic state. Tina Smith's retirement opened the door, and Democrats are still slugging it out in a competitive primary, which naturally hands Republicans a better shot than they'd get against a sitting incumbent. This isn't a deep blue state either. It's been drifting rightward outside the Twin Cities for years. Still, every poll we've seen gives Democrats the edge in the general, and the national environment is working against Republicans closing that gap. It could tighten, but for now, Minnesota stays blue. New Hampshire is right there with it. Jeanne Shaheen's retirement takes the incumbency advantage off the table, and Republicans actually have a legitimate name on the ballot in former Senator Scott Brown, their recognizable nominee, going up against Democratic Congressman Chris Pappas. A few polls have shown this basically tied, which is why I'm not ready to call it safe. But Pappas has already proven he can win tough races, and New Hampshire has a habit of snapping back to Democrats whenever the national mood favors them. Republicans have a path, but they need the whole environment to shift in their favor first. Likely blue, it stays. Flip to the Republican side, and Florida is likely red, and it's not particularly close. Ashley Moody starts with a real cushion in a state that swung hard rightward over the last several cycles, and recent polling backs that up. Yes, Florida's a massive, expensive media market that'll keep grabbing headlines, but the fundamentals are brutal for Democrats right now. It's not mathematically impossible, it's just not one of their live opportunities this cycle. Montana lands in the same bucket. It's an open seat which injects a little unpredictability, and Democrats have occasionally found candidates who overperform there. But the current polling still shows Republicans with a comfortable cushion, enough that even in a strong Democratic year, they can afford to bleed some support and still win. Could it tighten? Maybe. Likely red for now. Now we're getting to the races that actually decide the majority, starting with the lean Democratic column. First up, Georgia. Senator Jon Ossoff is defending his seat against Republican Congressman Mike Collins. And let's be honest, Georgia is never a gimme. Trump won it in 2024, so nobody should treat Ossoff as untouchable just because he's the incumbent. That said, the newest numbers are genuinely good for him. One poll has him up 9, another up 4. Those margins will almost certainly tighten as undecideds break, and Collins should consolidate most of the Republican base by November. But Ossoff's fundraising machine and organization are massive, and he's led consistently enough that I'm comfortable putting Georgia in the lean blue column. North Carolina is where this map starts getting dramatic because it's the first Republican-held seat flipping to lean Democratic. Former Governor Roy Cooper is taking on Republican Michael Whatley, and the polling here is honestly stunning. Cooper's clearing 50% in the current average, while Whatley sits below 44. A recent Fox News poll had it 53 to 44. Now, North Carolina has burned Democrats before. Republicans have somehow found a way to win nearly every close federal race there. But Cooper isn't those candidates. This is a guy who's won statewide 6 separate times, including 2 governor's races, in a state that simultaneously hands its electoral votes to Republican presidential nominees. That's a track record, not a poll spike. Whatley has time to close the gap, and I expect this to tighten before November, but based on where things stand, North Carolina leans Democratic. Then there's Maine, which just got flipped on its head. Troy Jackson locking up the nomination changes everything here. I want to be careful. Susan Collins has survived brutal years before, including cruising to re-election in 2020, even while Maine went comfortably for Biden. Her brand as an independent-minded Republican has always let her poach crossover voters Democrats normally count on. That's exactly why I wouldn't call this an easy pickup. But the polling can't be ignored. University of New Hampshire has Jackson up 49 to 46, and another July survey had him ahead 49 to 44. Jackson's biography helps too. A former logger from northern Maine who once identified as a Republican himself. That's a very different profile than the Democrats Collins has beaten before, and it gives him a real shot at chipping into her rural advantage. Collins still has more money and decades of institutional muscle, and Jackson's timeline to build a statewide operation is short. But he's the nominee now. Democrats are consolidating fast, and the polls have him ahead. Maine moves into lean Democratic. Now, the knife's edge races, the ones that will genuinely decide who controls the Senate. Let's start with the 2 tilting Republican. Iowa first. I had this leaning red not long ago, but the gap has completely disappeared. The current average has Democrat Josh Turek and Republican Ashley Hinson tied at 46.7% apiece. Turek's proven he's a credible statewide candidate in a state that voted for Obama twice, and Democrats did make real gains here in 2018. But Iowa has moved hard right since then. Republicans hold nearly every statewide office, and Trump carried it comfortably 3 cycles in a row. Hinson also brings real experience from representing a swing district. In a true toss-up, those underlying fundamentals tip the scale for me. Turek could absolutely pull this off, and it might come down to a single point, but by the narrowest possible margin, Iowa tilts Republican. Nebraska is the other one, and honestly, it might be the most underrated race on this entire map. Independent Dan Osborne is going up against Republican Senator Pete Ricketts. Osborne stunned everyone by how close he came in 2024, proving he can build a coalition that goes well beyond the usual Democratic base. His superpower is that he's not running with a D next to his name, that lets him pull in voters who are fed up with Republicans but would never pull the lever for a traditional Democrat. Some polls have shown this shockingly tight, though the more recent average gives Ricketts a modest edge. Republicans learned their lesson last time, too. They're taking Osborne seriously now and building a campaign specifically to choke off his crossover appeal. Nebraska's red lean gives Ricketts the advantage, but don't sleep on this race. It tilts Republican barely. Now the tilt Democratic states, and this is where the map really starts to shift in Democrats' favor, Michigan first. Gary Peters' retirement opened up a seat in maybe the most evenly split state in America. Republican Mike Rogers came within a hair of winning Michigan's other Senate seat back in 2024, so he's a legitimate threat. But Michigan keeps electing Democrats statewide, even in years when Republicans win the presidential vote there. And Democratic nominee Abdul El-Sayed should get a modest lift from the national environment until the primary fully wraps up and more general election polling comes in. This stays a tilt, but it tilts blue. Alaska might be the hardest call on the entire board. Democrat Mary Peltola is challenging Republican Senator Dan Sullivan, and the head-to-head polling is all over the place. One recent survey has Sullivan up 47 to 45. An earlier one had Peltola ahead by 2, and polls that include additional candidates have sometimes shown her leading by even more. In other words, there is no clean signal here. Sullivan has the built-in advantage of running as a Republican in a state that usually goes red at the presidential level. But Peltola has already done what most Democrats can't: win statewide in Alaska, and her political identity plays far more independent than the national party brand. The extra candidates in the race add another layer of unpredictability that could work in her favor. It's genuinely razor thin, but by less than a point, I'm putting Alaska in the tilt Democratic column. Ohio might be the single biggest swing on this entire map compared to where things stood a few months back. Former Senator Sherrod Brown is trying to claw his way back into the seat he lost in 2024, this time against Republican Senator Jon Husted. On paper, this should be a Republican hold. Trump carried Ohio 3 straight times, and Brown himself lost here just last cycle. But the newest Real Clear Politics average has Brown at 47.8% to Husted's 47.2%, a lead of 0.6 of a point. Brown has always run as a different breed of Democrat in Ohio, built around wages, manufacturing, and organized labor, and that message has let him consistently outrun the rest of his party in small towns and working-class counties. Husted still benefits from Ohio's rightward drift and national party support, but Brown doesn't need to resurrect the old Ohio Democratic coalition. He just needs to beat the modern Democratic baseline by a few points, and right now, the numbers say he's doing exactly that. This race could flip several more times before November, but as of today, Ohio tilts Democratic. And now the one you've been waiting for, Texas. This is, without question, the boldest call on the entire map. Republican Ken Paxton is facing Democrat James Talarico in a race that would have sounded absurd at the start of this cycle. Texas hasn't elected a Democrat statewide in decades, and Republicans still dominate rural turnout with one of the strongest statewide operations in the country. But the polling right now tells a very different story than Texas history would suggest. Several June surveys showed a dead heat or Paxton up by just a point or two, and one of the newest July polls actually had Talarico ahead 54 to 47. The broader average still gives Paxton roughly a 1-point edge once you factor in additional candidates, which tells you this isn't drifting toward either side. It's a genuine toss-up. The reason I'm giving Talarico the slightest edge comes down to the matchup itself. Paxton is one of the most polarizing figures in Texas politics. He'll lock down committed Republicans, but his baggage creates real openings among suburban voters who normally lean right, especially around Dallas and Houston, exactly where Democrats have made their biggest gains in recent cycles. Talarico is also a very different kind of Democratic candidate, a strong, natural communicator who can talk about faith and public education in ways that resonate beyond the usual Democratic coalition. He doesn't need to turn Texas blue. He just needs to peel off a small slice of voters who dislike Paxton but usually vote Republican anyway. That's still an enormous lift, and Paxton could easily consolidate the base and win comfortably. Texas has teased Democrats before, only for Republicans to pull away at the finish line, so take this with the appropriate grain of salt. But based purely on where the polling sits right now, Paxton can't seem to build a clear lead, while Talarico has actually led in a statewide survey. In a favorable Democratic environment, that's enough for me to make the most aggressive call on this entire map. By less than a point, Texas tilts Democratic. So here's where it all lands. Add it all up, and Democrats finish this map with 52 Senate seats to the Republicans' 48. They hold Georgia and Michigan. They flip North Carolina and Maine. Peltola narrowly survives in Alaska. Brown completes his comeback in Ohio, and in the single biggest upset of the entire cycle, Tallarico takes down Paxton in Texas. Republicans just barely hang on in Iowa and Nebraska, which keeps this from becoming an even bigger Democratic wave. Net result, a 5-seat gain. One more than Democrats actually need to flip the chamber. But don't mistake that for a done deal. A 1 or 2 point shift is all it would take to flip Michigan, Alaska, Ohio, or Texas back to red. Lose 2 of those, and we're staring at a 50-50 Senate. Lose 3, and Republicans keep the majority outright. That's what makes this map so fascinating right now. Democrats genuinely have more paths to the majority than they've had in months, but almost every one of them runs through states that were solidly Republican just a cycle or 2 ago. Maine and North Carolina look like their strongest, most realistic pickups. Ohio is basically a coin flip. Alaska hinges entirely on whether Peltola can keep pulling in crossover voters. And Texas could either be the biggest Democratic breakthrough in a generation or just one more election where Republicans find a way to hold on when it matters most. That's the map as of today. 52 Democrats, 48 Republicans, and Democrats retaking the Senate barely. Now, I want to hear from you. Which state do you think I've got wrong? Do you actually buy that Troy Jackson can knock off Susan Collins? And is Texas finally ready to elect a Democrat statewide, or are these polls setting Democrats up for the same heartbreak they felt before? Drop your predictions in the comments.